Rome, the small city-state that later became the Empire of Europe. And when I say the Empire, I really mean it was the Empire. In fact, without Rome, we actually don't have what we understand a modern Europe. At least, that's what many people believe. In fact, before anyone starts understanding on how Rome actually became an empire, to this type of subject at hand, we can understand that many people believe that without Rome, there would never be a Europe. There would never be anything identical to how it would have been. However, that's the thing. In our own timeline, Rome actually was very insignificant, and yet became a great empire. However, before Rome became known as the Great Empire of Europe, it originally looked like this: a small city-state in Italy, surrounded by vast other kingdoms and empires. So, what if in this alternate timeline, it never existed? Rome never became a great empire, it never rose from the ashes. Well, we're gonna ask that right now. It's an alternate 387 BC, and the sack of Rome has come. And in such, in our own timeline, the Celts that were sacking Rome actually went as far as to actually humiliate them at the Battle of Allia, slaughtering their entire army. And as well, even further, well, forcing the Romans to actually go to the Capitoline Hill for safety, because of the Capitoline Hill was mostly a fortress. In fact, in our own timeline, it was because of the sacred birds of Rome which were on the Capitoline Hill that actually were disturbed by the Celts, which were doing a night assault on the said Capitoline Hill. What if in this alternate timeline, those said flock of birds weren't there to actually warn the Romans. The Capitoline Hill would have been overtaken, and everyone in Rome would have been enslaved or slaughtered. Rome would cease to exist, of which, in our own timeline, was actually very close to happening. So, what would happen, say for example, if Rome actually did not exist? What if it did actually get sacked and destroyed? Who would take its place? Now, immediately a lot of people are going to say, oh, one of the other Italian peoples that lived in the region. Well, that's the thing. We have to think about this. Are we talking about the Gauls, the Samnites, the Etruscans, the Latin and Italians, the Greek city-states? All and such were not entirely that powerful, and in fact these were all city-state cultures as well. In fact, Rome rose to the occasion mainly because it had no other choice but to. In fact, in this alternate timeline, I can actually see that none of these kingdoms or these people actually unify Italy, mainly because they are so divided. In fact, the only time they ever unite is to fight an outside force. The Etruscans were viewed too weak and ineffective to fight against anybody invading, and the Romans proved that. The Samnites could actually be a major military force, but the problem is, they never unified. And the Latin and Italian tribes, well, you already guessed it, they were never going to unify at all. And as well, the Greek city-states actually didn't have much power in the region. So, who would come to be? Well, we can actually take a look at our own timeline with the Punic Wars, mainly with Carthage. Carthage itself, as we understand it, would have actually wanted to land in the region, especially Sicily. However, since there is no major military power in the region to stopping them and actually conquering the region, we could already guess what could actually happen. In such, this is an alternate 264 BC. There is no Punic War, but Carthage is expanding, mainly through its trade dominance, and overall, it would start to conquer various regions and holdings. Seeing the fact that each of the city-states are all divided in Italy. Slowly and surely though, probably by the year of 1054, this would be our alternate timeline. Carthage is claiming lands in parts of Italy, and pretty much wants to dominate the entire Italian peninsula. However, one major military factor also comes into play: Macedonia. Now here's the thing, many people are asking, why Macedonia? Why not the Seleucids? Well, the Seleucids have their own problems at hand. One, their empire is too big, and they have to face several civil wars. In fact, Rome was the only reason why the Macedonians and the Seleucids actually were defeated in our own timeline. In fact, Rome was actually the reason why both the Seleucid and Macedonian empires fell, mainly because of several reasons. 1, the military, and 2, politics. The Roman politics actually badly defeated the idealism of the Macedonian political system, almost to the point that it divided Macedonia. In fact, the Macedonian Wars actually almost pushed Rome to its breaking point. But yes, even in this alternate timeline, Macedonia actually viewed itself as the protectorate of the city-states in Italy. So much so that 1, it would view Carthage as an enemy. Now in our own timeline, Carthage, Macedonia, and the Seleucids were major allies. However, in this alternate timeline, that is pretty much different. For one major reason, Rome. Rome does not exist. Since Rome does not exist, you guessed it. Since that Rome doesn't exist, Carthage can't actually ally itself Macedonia. Maybe with the Seleucids, but even such, the Macedonians, Seleucids, and Ptolemaic Egypt actually made an alliance together, just in case if any one of them was to go to war against each other. If the Seleucid Empire would invade the Macedonians, Ptolemaic Egypt would invade the Seleucids. If Macedonia was to invade the Seleucid Empire, then vice versa. So you could see what could actually happen here. In such, we can actually see the Macedonians invading Italy and be viewed as liberators. Kind of like how Carthage was to the said Italians in our own timeline during the Second Punic War with Hamilcarca. And the thing is, I can actually see the Macedonians winning battles against the Carthaginians. And a lot of you are going to be wondering why. Well, that can easily be answered. Because 1, Carthage put most of its entire military training in its navy and war elephants. In fact, its entire land-based military was made up of mercenaries, not foot soldiers. In fact, the majority of its foot soldiers were protecting its major cities. That's it. And the thing is, the Macedonian pike formation was the king of the battlefield before the infamous Roman legionnaires. In fact, if you want to see a video on why the Roman legions actually defeated the Macedonian phalanx, I recommend checking out Epimeteus, who explains this very thoroughly in some of his videos. Of which, this explains my point. In fact, the Macedonian pike formation was unbeatable in military combat, almost to the point that 1, it defeated countless enemy armies in history. In fact, there is accounts that it even defeated the Celts at the Battle of Thermopylae. Yes, that Thermopylae pass after the sacking of Delphi, led by Brennus, not related to the same Brennus that sacked Rome. In such, we can actually understand that 1, the Macedonian military formation was very strong enough to defeat their opponents. So much so that 1, Rome actually almost lost to the Macedonians. In fact, if any of y'all have ever heard the term Pyrrhic victory, well, this comes from another type of war when Rome fought against the Macedonians. There is a Macedonia, in which actually invaded Italy and actually was winning, but lost major military units. And in this alternate timeline, though, Carthage doesn't have the Roman-style military system, and can easily be wiped out by the said Macedonian military system. Before anyone starts saying, oh but wait, Carthage has war elephants. Yeah, when did the war elephants help Carthage during the Punic Wars in our own timeline? In fact, last time I checked at the Battle of Zama, they actually ran back into the Carthaginian lines. And the thing is, Macedonia actually made a tactical design to defeat war elephants, of which was actually based off of none other than Alexander the Great's military victories, such as the Battle of Gargamella, where they defeated Persian chariots. And besides, last thing I checked is that 1, elephants don't like to charge into a sharp pointy stick. So yeah, Carthage is pretty much doomed in this military campaign. Don't get me wrong, we could see Hannibal and as well Hamilcar and Hannibal Barca, but I doubt that they could easily be the major military power by this timeline. By the end of the first ever Punic Wars in our own timeline, we'd probably see Macedonia actually claiming the lands of Italy, and as well even Sicily. So much so that one, it is a major military power. Although, also in this alternate timeline, I could probably even see none other than the Seleucids falling into major collapse. Because one, in our own timeline, they had faced several civil wars and are constantly fighting each other, mainly because the empire was too big. So, yeah, we could probably see Macedonia even claiming lands in parts of Anatolia in order to actually push back the said Seleucids, at least for a while. And even the said Ptolemaic dynasty might even claim lands further north, mainly in the lands of Judea. All the while in this alternate timeline, the Carthaginians, who lost their land and territory, now have to deal with an even worse scenario. That's right, the mercenary revolt. If none of you all know about the mercenary revolt in our own timeline, Carthage actually, when it lost the First Punic War, had to deal with the mercenaries revolting because they didn't get their pay. So we could probably see an alternate scenario just like this, which could actually lead to Macedonia even claiming furthermore territory from the said Carthaginian Empire. Carthage, that now lost these lands, would have to find another way to actually reclaim them. And, you guessed it, the invasion of Iberia. The invasion of Iberia in our own timeline also happened with Hannibal Barca and Hamilcar Barca, who invaded, but in doing so, this led to a later future war between the said Romans and the said Carthaginian kingdom. So, this would also happen in this alternate timeline. The Seleucids in this alternate timeline could probably also re-secure themselves with Antiochus III or IV, depending on who we can actually have at this alternate timeline, and in such, re-secure the empire. However, I doubt that they would be the major military power to go against the said Macedonians, especially right at this point. Because of this new Punic War, Carthage still doesn't have its navy anymore, nor does it have its major military. And even worse, it's now going to lose an even worse war against the said Macedonians, who are now stronger even more than ever. So much so that we could probably see the Macedonians even pushing back the said Carthaginians through the region of Iberia, and especially on the sea. So, in other words, it would be just the Battle of Zama all over again, but this time even worse. But in such, when Carthage is now facing a war against the said Macedonians, they are also losing land to the Ptolemaic Egypt in the east. So much so that one, the Berbers and such claim land around the region of Carthage. Carthage no longer is a major military power. But in such, the Seleucids also reclaim land in parts of Judea, probably as a resecurement of its border. However, I do have to state that one, even in this alternate timeline, I doubt we could actually see the rise of certain kingdoms, especially by this point. By the final end of the said Third and final Punic War, Carthage sacked and sieged. Now, it wouldn't be called the Punic War, since Punic is Latin for the Phoenicians. I would actually pretty much call this the Macedonian-Phoenician War. But I'd like to hear your ideas what it could be called. But in such, after this major defeat, Macedonia is even massive in its power structure, so much to the point that it could actually dominate the region entirely. It is the major power of the West, and of Europe, and the Mediterranean itself, while Ptolemaic Egypt controls, well, the region of Egypt, and as well around the Red Sea. The Ptolemies, without Rome getting involved, actually do grow in power. So do the Seleucids. In fact, in our own timeline, it was because of Rome that led these empires to their actual ruin. However, one major thing does play out. I highly doubt I could actually see Macedonia invading Gaul. To this scenario, we could probably see something else entirely. Gaul might actually grow more Hellenistic, or as well more closely to the said Macedonians. Kind of like how the said Gauls did to Rome, especially in the southern regions. They were enriched more, and it can evenly be militarized. In fact, something identical to this actually happened in our own timeline with Gaul and Britannia. Since there is no Rome, there is no Gallic Wars. In fact, in our own timeline, Rome thought it'd be impossible to defeat the Gauls in the north. So much so that they entirely went against any invasion. But that didn't stop Julius Caesar. However, in this alternate timeline, Gaul unifies probably within the next 50 years into an who knows scenario of who could actually claim the power. However, also in major type of form is Britannia. In our own timeline, Britannia was unifying under one king, Cassivellaunus. Cassivellaunus would actually, in our own timeline, start to actually expand his kingdom. However, it was because of Julius Caesar that caused problems for him. So, without Julius Caesar, we don't see the conquest of Gaul or Britannia. In fact, even the Romans, as I stated, would view it as an impossibility. And the Macedonians didn't actually want to go and invade the regions because it was viewed too wild. But knowing one thing, Gaul could probably fall under one full king. It just depends on which king it would be. All the while, Britannia actually becomes its own type of kingdom itself under the reign of Cassivellaunus, who slowly conquers regions in the southern parts of Britannia. By the time of Augustus Caesar, Europe actually looks way more different than we understand. In fact, the Germanic tribes are still a confederation of many tribal people and can be conquered by various type of claims. However, without Rome conquering the region like it did in our own timeline, I don't know we could actually see in this alternate scenario. The lands of Dacia to the north of the Danube are actually its own border. All the while, Macedonia tries to keep its border secure with the Gauls, preventing them from invading or raiding the region. But every once in a while, there probably will be. In such, though, we could also see the Seleucids actually campaigning in the region of the steppe, and even securing itself even further north, possibly to actually obtain certain trade routes. All the while, Ptolemaic Egypt is further expanding itself further to the south. By the time of Augustus as well, we could even see that maybe Gaul itself could actually go as far as to colonize or even actually incorporate parts of Germanic tribes into their holding. Honestly, I don't know what this could look like, but this is as best as that scenario as I can understand what it can end up looking like. Slowly but surely, just like Rome had done, Gaul would do the same. Now, pretty much brings up to another type of question. What about Christianity? Now, in such, many people believe that without Rome, Christianity would never have spread. However, that's the thing. Even without Rome, Christianity would have still spread in this alternate timeline. How so? Simple. Let's take a look at all the people that actually, the apostles and such, that actually did go outside of Rome. Peter died in Rome. St. Andrew died in Greece. John died in Patmos. However, we can understand that Thomas made his way all the way to India. India, I might add. Outside of the Roman Empire. An entire country away from Roman Empire. Without Rome, I could actually see Christianity still spreading the way it does. In fact, Bartholomew actually died in the region of Armenia. As well, we see various type of other people such as Matthew in Ethiopia and Parthia, as well as Simon and Jude dying in Persia. So, yeah, even without Rome, Christianity still spreads. It just spreads a different type of way. How so? Simple. It would probably spread actually a little bit differently, not through the Latin alphabet, but through the Greek alphabet. Because of this, Christianity could still spread with a type of system and history and such. Even without Rome, Christianity still spreads the same way, and in such, might even spread a little bit differently. Except without the Latin alphabet, but with the Greek alphabet. That's right, anybody that loves their modern day alphabet, here's the thing, your alphabet that's Latin, that is going to have to be Greek now. The Hellenized version is entirely. But the thing is, Christianity would still spread. In fact, the Library of Alexandria wouldn't be sacked and destroyed by the Romans. So we could pretty much understand that, one, Christianity would also be sent there as well, and could actually thrive. Christianity could also go into the regions of parts of Parthia, and as well the regions of Syria, all throughout the regions of the Seleucids. Macedonia could also go through that type of scenario. In fact, even into Gaul and as well Dacia, we can actually see this. However, I could still probably see the deaths of every one of the martyrs, but because of their faith, they don't really die. In fact, I'm Catholic, and even I view this as, well, yeah, doesn't matter if there was no Rome, the faith will still spread. And many people are going to be arguing about this. Oh really, how would it spread? Simple, the merchant trade. In fact, this is actually how Christianity spread its way throughout the entirety of history in our own timeline. Major example of this is with the Kievan Rus. Rome was no longer existent, but it still spread into the region. As well, we can also see Christianity spread in our own timeline even to as far as parts of Asia. So yeah, Christianity would still spread, just not by Rome, but by the merchant trade. However, I could probably see an alternate scenario where, one, there is actually, say for example, a Macedonian, Seleucid, or Ptolemaic Egyptian king, then in which actually would be given a sign from heaven, like it was in our own timeline with Constantine the Great. So yeah, use this symbol to conquer, or whatever. In which, in our own timeline, a lot of people would use this symbol as a divine rule symbol, even though that's not what it's supposed to be used for. In such, though, we could probably understand that before the 3rd century crisis, we can actually see the regions of the Macedonians as well as the Ptolemaic and the Seleucids expanding and thriving. The Ptolemies expanding even further down the Nile. And without Rome, they can actually conquer this region. The only reason why the Romans couldn't conquer the Kingdom of Kush is because, one, they had campaigns further in other regions. So much so that, one, they had to constantly go back and forth. Without Rome, we could actually see the Ptolemies actually expanding even further. Maybe even all the way towards the Persian Gulf. In fact, just like in our own timeline though as well, I could also see the Germanic people slowly unifying into different separate kingdoms. Kind of like they were in our own timeline. In other words, one conquers the other in order to, well, better survive against their opponents. However, with the 3rd century crisis, I could probably also see the Seleucids maybe falling into another civil war, maybe with the Parthians and various other regions. So much so that the Seleucids have to go to war against these regions. And all the while, Macedonia would even lose its lands in the west. So much so that it has to go on campaign yet again. I could actually see this campaign slowly going the same way it did in our own timeline. Macedonia might even go and conquer the region of during the 3rd century crisis and fully reconquer said Carthage. Maybe it's because, one, Christianity had expanded into the region and actually, well, told the king, hey, use this symbol to conquer the region. So in such he does. Seleucids would also have the same problem. In such, though, Armenia in the north would probably even separate from the Seleucids, while the Seleucids are busy fighting in other conflicts, leaving the Seleucids' western territory fully exposed to the said invading forces. So yeah, even in this alternate timeline, I don't think we can actually see much of a difference. In fact, the Huns would still come in history and immediately become the major problem in the territory. The Dacians could be conquered, just as they were in our own timeline. Armenia is invaded from the north. As well, so is Macedonia threatened over across the Danube. But because of the Danube River, we could probably see them holding out, at least for a while. But because Macedonia is more worried about the Huns, they would have to worry about the invasion of the Gauls. And because of the Gauls, maybe even Iberia and Carthage could separate as well again. So much so that even if the Seleucids fully reconquer their territory, I highly doubt that they could easily hold on to what remains as well. Armenia has grown even stronger after the death of Attila. Macedonia has even expanded even further east into Anatolia. All the while, the Franks in the north have conquered their enemies. The Gauls in modern-day France are even bigger and even more of an expansionist type kingdom. All the while, the Britons in the region of Britannia are even stronger and unified. Ptolemaic Egypt has even expanded itself even further down the Red Sea and even into the Gulf and into the Indian Ocean. So much so, I could actually see this entire scenario coming to play as it was in our own timeline. However, one major thing does play out. One, there probably would never be any Islam. Why? Simple, because of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies control the trade route, and even worse, they actually control the region where Mecca is. In this alternate timeline, we could actually see the Ptolemies actually putting down the said Islamic revolt before it ever has a chance to rise. And such, with this alternate scenario, we don't have the Crusades. No Crusades, no downfall of Macedonia like there is in our own timeline. The Seleucids also survive just barely. In fact, it is probably a newer empire. In fact, by the time of the 14th century, this is our alternate map of history. Europe is completely divided, but yet surprisingly united in different type of idealisms. Christianity has been separated in so many ways. In fact, the way I explain that is, one, in our own timeline, Christianity was badly divided between one bishop in one region and a bishop in the other. So much so it actually caused a bishop type war in our own timeline. Until Constantine the Great actually stopped it from happening. I wonder if he could have stopped the Great Schism in our own timeline if he had lived in that time. The thing is, we would actually see Hellenized Christianity in the regions of Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and the Macedonians, while we see more of an Orthodox style in Armenia, as well as the Rus and parts of Eastern Europe. Northern Europe would have more of well, I guess you could call it a Germanic Christianity or Aryan Christianity, while there's Celtic Christianity in the parts of Gaul and Britannia, Scotland and Ireland. Scandinavian would have its own type of Christianity, and Iberia and Carthage might actually have Hellenistic, I don't know, but man, that is a huge one to think about. Let me know in the comments below of what you can actually see from this timeline, or what you think could have actually happened if Rome never existed. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Anyways, this has been Celtic Templar. Hope to see you all in the next one, my brothers and sisters of the Order. If any of you have other ideas for any of our other what-if scenarios, let me know in the comments below, and I'll take a look at them as soon as I can. Anyways, like and subscribe for more to help the channel grow. And until then, my brothers and sisters of the Order, have a great day.